Nothing terrible happened today. No crisis, no huge argument, no life-changing problem. You just have one email to answer, one call to return, one small thing you know shouldn't be difficult. And somehow your whole mind replies, I can't deal with this right now. That's the confusing part. You know the task is small. So why does it feel so heavy? Maybe the real question isn't how big the thing in front of you is. Maybe it's how much capacity you had left when it arrived. Because sometimes overwhelm doesn't look the way we expect it to. We imagine overwhelm should require something obviously overwhelming. A breakup, a financial crisis, a huge deadline, someone getting sick, a major conflict. And when nothing like that is happening, struggling with something tiny can feel almost embarrassing. There's one cup in the sink, why can't I just wash it? Someone sent a completely normal message. Why don't I want to answer? You need to choose what to eat. Why does that suddenly feel like a complicated decision? You have to make one appointment, open one document, put away one thing. And instead of doing it, you stare at it. Then you start getting frustrated with yourself. Because now there are two problems, the small task and the fact that you're somehow overwhelmed by the small task. That second problem can become heavier than the first. You tell yourself, this is ridiculous. Why am I being so lazy? Other people deal with much more than this. Nothing is even wrong. And technically, you may be right about one thing. The task really is small. But that doesn't mean the load is. Imagine you're carrying a backpack. Someone puts one book inside. No problem. Another. Still fine. Another. You continue walking. Eventually, the backpack becomes heavy. You've adjusted gradually. Then someone hands you a single pen, and you think, I cannot carry one more thing. From the outside, that makes no sense. It's a pen. But the pen isn't the whole weight, it's simply the thing that arrived after everything else. Let's call this the capacity gap. The capacity gap is the difference between how small a demand looks from the outside. It is how much room you actually have left to deal with it. When capacity is high, a small inconvenience stays small. The dishwasher needs emptying? Fine. Someone changes plans? Annoying but manageable. An email needs a careful reply? You sit down and write it. But when your capacity is already stretched, the same tasks can feel completely different. The dishes become another thing I have to deal with. The changed plan becomes, I cannot reorganize one more part of my day. The email becomes, I don't have enough brain left to figure out the correct response. The task hasn't necessarily changed. Your relationship to the task has. And one reason this is difficult to recognize is that not all load looks dramatic. Some load is loud. You know when you're dealing with it. A deadline is obvious. An emergency is obvious, a huge fight is obvious. But other load stays in the background. Remember to call mom. I need to check that bill. Don't forget the appointment Thursday. I still haven't answered that message. Something feels weird with my friend. I should probably exercise. I need to buy groceries. I haven't been sleeping properly. Why did my boss phrase that email like that? I need to figure out what I'm doing next month. None of these thoughts may be catastrophic, but your mind doesn't necessarily wait for catastrophe before it begins using resources. Unfinished things still have to be remembered. Uncertain things still invite monitoring. Social tension still occupies attention. Decisions still have to be made, and even pleasant responsibilities can become demanding when there are enough of them. So you can wake up on a completely normal Tuesday, already carrying a surprising amount of invisible weight. You answer messages, make decisions, switch between tasks. Remember what comes next. Suppress irritation. Try to focus. Adjust plans. Keep conversations going. Ignore something you're worried about because now isn't the time. Smile when someone talks to you. Try not to think about the thing you're still thinking about. And then at 6:14 in the evening, you drop a spoon on the floor. And for some reason, that spoon feels personal. You stare at it. Maybe you want to cry. Maybe you get angry. Maybe you just leave it there. And some part of you immediately says, seriously, you're upset about a spoon? But maybe you aren't upset about the spoon. Maybe the spoon is simply the first demand that arrived after the internal sign already said, no space left. This is where people confuse trigger with cause. The trigger is the thing that finally gets your attention. The cause may be everything that happened before it. Think about a glass filling with water. Drop, drop, drop. Then one final drop causes water to spill over the edge. If you only look at that final drop, the reaction can seem absurd. How could one drop do all of that? It didn't. Let's call this the last drop problem. We tend to judge our reaction by looking only at the last thing that happened. One tiny request, one notification, one minor inconvenience. Then we compare the size of that event with the size of our reaction. Small event. Big reaction. Therefore, something must be wrong with me. But that equation leaves out the starting condition. How full was the glass before the drop arrived? That question changes everything. Imagine 2 mornings. On the first morning, you slept well. You aren't rushed. Your week feels under control. You open the refrigerator and realize you're out of milk. You think, oh, I'll get some later. That's it. Now imagine the same milk on another morning. You slept badly. You're already late. 3 people need something from you. You have a conversation from yesterday still running through your head. Your phone has 6 messages you don't want to answer. You open the refrigerator. No milk. And suddenly you're standing there thinking, I cannot do this. Same refrigerator, same missing milk. Different system receiving the information. That's why asking, is this objectively a big problem, doesn't always tell you much about why you're overwhelmed. A better question may be, what condition was I already in when this happened? And that can be uncomfortable, because it means the small thing may be giving you information you were successfully ignoring. Maybe you've been functioning, but functioning and recovering are not the same thing. You can continue meeting deadlines while becoming more depleted. You can keep answering everyone while becoming increasingly unwilling to hear another notification. You can still go to work, still cook, still joke, still look normal. And because you're technically doing everything, you assume everything must be fine. This is one of the traps that comes with being capable. If you can keep going, you may use your ability to keep going as evidence that continuing costs nothing. But capacity doesn't have to disappear all at once. It can narrow. You still have enough for the important meeting, not enough for the unnecessary phone call, enough to take care of someone else, not enough to decide what you want for dinner, enough to finish the urgent task, not enough to put away the laundry afterward. And this creates another layer of confusion. You can do something objectively much harder in one part of the day, then feel defeated by something embarrassingly easy later. You give a presentation to 30 people, then come home and cannot answer, what do you want to eat? You solve a difficult problem at work. Then stare at a pile of clothes as if you've been asked to climb a mountain. So you conclude, I must be lazy. But laziness doesn't explain why you were capable 3 hours earlier. The more useful clue is that different tasks arrive at different points in your available capacity. The hard task may have received the best part of you. The tiny task took whatever remained. And sometimes what remains is almost nothing. This can also happen emotionally. Maybe nothing dramatic is wrong, but you've been doing a lot of emotional holding, listening to someone else's problems, trying not to react to tension at work, being patient with a difficult family member, pretending you're not disappointed, waiting for an answer, trying to look normal around someone you're angry with. None of these moments necessarily becomes a crisis, but emotional restraint is still work. And then someone asks a completely innocent question, hey, can you do one more thing? And you hear yourself answer more sharply than you meant to. Later you feel guilty. They didn't do anything wrong, and maybe they didn't. But they encountered you at the edge of what you had left. This doesn't excuse hurting people. Capacity explains reactions. It doesn't automatically justify them. That's an important distinction. If you snap at someone because you're overloaded, their hurt still matters. But understanding the overload gives you something more useful than shame. It gives you a place to intervene. Because shame usually says, why can't you handle basic life? Understanding asks, what has been taking up so much room? That is a much better question. And this is the midpoint. Maybe the small thing isn't creating all of the overwhelm. Maybe it's revealing the overwhelm that was already there. The tiny task is not always the problem. Sometimes it's the measurement. It shows you how much capacity remained. That's why one of the least helpful things you can say to yourself in these moments is, but it's not even a big deal. You already know that. Knowing the task is small does not create more bandwidth. If anything, it can add another demand. Now I also have to stop feeling overwhelmed. So instead of one difficult moment, you have 3. Do the thing. Stop feeling this way. Explain why you're failing at something simple. That's how small tasks become identity judgments. You aren't just avoiding an email anymore. You're wondering whether you're becoming incompetent. You aren't just leaving dishes in the sink. You're asking what's wrong with your life. You aren't just ignoring a message. You're worrying that you're a terrible friend. This is what we can call the small task trap. A tiny task becomes evidence in a much larger case against yourself. And once that happens, the emotional weight of the task increases. Now answering the email isn't just answering the email. It's proving that you're still functional. Cleaning the room isn't cleaning the room. It's proving that you have your life together. Going to the store isn't going to the store. It's proving that you're not failing adulthood. That's a lot of symbolic weight to put on milk. And the more ashamed you become, the more likely you are to avoid the task. Then the task remains visible. Every time you see it, you remember that you haven't done it. Now a 5-minute task begins generating hours of background pressure. This is one reason avoidance can make small demands feel larger over time. The practical size stays the same. The emotional meaning grows. Yesterday, I need to reply to that email. Today, I still haven't replied. Tomorrow? Now it's awkward that I haven't replied. 2 days later, what am I even supposed to say after waiting this long? The original task was one email. The new task includes guilt, explanation, uncertainty, and self-judgment. So if you're overwhelmed by small things, there may actually be 2 different patterns happening. Sometimes your capacity is genuinely low. Other times, avoidance allows a small thing to gather emotional weight. And sometimes both are true. You had little capacity. So you postponed it. Postponing made it heavier. Now your capacity is even more strained because the unfinished task keeps following you. That's a loop. And breaking that loop does not begin with yelling at yourself to be more disciplined. First, you need to identify what kind of problem you're actually dealing with. Is the task difficult? Is the task emotionally loaded? Or is your capacity low? Those require different answers. If the task is difficult, simplify the task. If the task carries emotional meaning, deal with the meaning. If your capacity is low, reducing the task may help. You also need to stop pretending capacity is infinite. Imagine your phone battery is at 4%. You wouldn't look at it and say, "This app barely uses any power. Why can't the battery handle it?" The app may be small. 4% is still 4%. You wouldn't insult the battery. You would change what you expect from it until it can recharge. Humans are obviously more complicated than phones, but the principle is useful. You cannot measure a demand without also considering the system receiving it. So what does that look like in real life? Start by changing the question. Instead of, "Why can't I handle this?" try, "What else am I already handling?" That question often reveals what the word stress obscures. Maybe you've been worried for 3 weeks. Maybe you're sleeping badly. Maybe you've made dozens of decisions today. Maybe you've been socially switched on since morning. Maybe you're waiting for news. Maybe you're doing emotional work for 3 people. Maybe you haven't had a period of genuine non-demand in days. But nothing being catastrophic is not the same thing as nothing being demanding. Then separate the task from the story. The task might be, put 3 plates away. The story might be, my whole house is a disaster and I never keep up with anything. Those are different sizes. Do the task that exists, not the life judgment attached to it. 3 plates. Not, fix your entire personality, send 1 sentence. Not, repair every neglected friendship. Open the document. Not, become productive again. Small tasks become easier when they're allowed to remain small. And if even the genuinely tiny version still feels impossible, take that information seriously. Not dramatically. Seriously. Maybe the correct response isn't force harder. Maybe it's reduce incoming demands. Finish 1 open loop. Eat something. Sleep. Stop answering non-urgent messages for an hour. Ask someone else to handle 1 thing. Make fewer decisions. Leave something unoptimized. Give your attention somewhere to land. This isn't about turning every difficult afternoon into a major self-care project. It's about recognizing that recovery often requires fewer demands, not better arguments with yourself about why those demands shouldn't bother you. And there's another useful shift. Stop waiting until you are at 0 to believe that you are tired. A lot of people only give themselves permission to slow down when they can produce a dramatic justification. I haven't slept for 2 days. I'm sick. I'm having a breakdown. Something terrible happened. Then rest feels legitimate. But if nothing big is wrong, they keep going. So their body or mind has to become increasingly inconvenient before they listen. Maybe you don't need a catastrophe to justify changing pace. Maybe small things starting to feel unusually heavy are already information, not a diagnosis. Information. You can notice it before it becomes dramatic. That may actually be one of the more useful ways to think about overwhelm. Not as proof that you can't cope, as feedback about load, because the goal isn't to become someone who never feels overwhelmed by small things. Everyone has days where an absurdly minor inconvenience becomes one demand too many. The goal is to become better at reading the signal. Sometimes the signal says, this task has more emotional meaning than you're admitting. Sometimes, you've avoided this long enough that it's become heavier. Sometimes, you're expecting yourself to do 6 things at once. Sometimes, you're simply depleted. And sometimes, you need to stop mistaking capacity for character. You are not a better person at 80% battery than at 8. You're just operating under different conditions. So the next time one small thing suddenly feels enormous, notice the instinct to insult yourself. This is stupid. I should be able to do this. What is wrong with me? Then look again. Look at the tiny task, and then look behind it. What else are you carrying? What hasn't been finished? What have you been suppressing? What decisions have you already made? How long have you been switched on? How much space was actually left when this small thing arrived? Because maybe the task really is tiny. That doesn't mean your reaction came from nowhere. Sometimes the smallest thing feels the heaviest. It arrives when you're already carrying the most. Maybe the answer isn't to try to be stronger than every small demand. Maybe it's to stop waiting for something big to go wrong and admit the load is already heavy.